Hey everyone! Tonight we're stepping into the world of Rome, the empire that conquered vast stretches of the known world and still found room for remarkable levels of pettiness. Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into this journey together. When Rome captured a queen, it didn't see a defeated woman quietly reflecting on lost battles. Rome saw a problem, a complicated one, a logistical headache wearing a crown. Queens were not ordinary prisoners. They couldn't be cataloged, processed, and forgotten like seized weapons or defeated soldiers. They arrived with history attached. A captured queen was a walking political dilemma, graceful, visible, and deeply inconvenient. Rome thrived on order. It prized hierarchy, rules, and clear chains of authority. A queen in chains disrupted all of that simply by existing. She had ruled. She had commanded loyalty. People had followed her willingly, which already made her suspect. Worse still, she had done so without Roman approval, paperwork, or oversight. To Rome, the real danger wasn't her ability to fight, it was belief. Soldiers obey commands, followers believe, and belief is far harder to destroy. Rome disliked loose ends, especially ideological ones. This is why queens were never treated like common captives. A regular prisoner could be sold, enslaved, or executed with little debate. A queen triggered meetings, arguments, and uneasy conversations. Someone always pointed out that killing her outright might not be wise. Rome may have been ruthless, but it understood optics. Rome also had a habit of turning suffering into spectacle. A captured queen was a powerful symbol. She could be displayed, whispered about, pointed at without a word being spoken. Her presence alone said, "This is what happens when you rule without Rome." A living, humiliated queen was far more useful than a dead one. A corpse could become a martyr. A broken monarch became a warning that walked. There was ego involved too. Rome did not appreciate being challenged, and it especially disliked challenges from rulers who didn't answer to Roman authority. The punishment had to be thorough, it had to be humiliating, and above all, it had to be memorable. Once captured, a queen's fate was no longer about justice or mercy. It became a performance, carefully staged, well-attended, and impossible to ignore. Rome liked power arranged neatly. Authority flowed upward, stopped at Rome, and never questioned the system. Anything outside that structure created discomfort. Kings were familiar. Rome had dealt with them for centuries. They negotiated, paid tribute, rebelled, and lost in predictable ways. Queens, however, unsettled things. Not because Rome had never seen powerful women, but because a ruling queen suggested that authority could exist without Roman permission. She represented loyalty outside Rome's ecosystem. From Rome's perspective, this wasn't simple rebellion, it was ideological contamination. Officially, Rome never claimed to oppose female rulers. It was far too polished for that. Instead, Roman writers framed queens as excessive, emotional, unnatural, or dangerously charismatic, anything that made their rule seem illegitimate. This wasn't about gender alone, it was about control. Rome despised anyone who made power look achievable without them. A queen who governed effectively and resisted Rome made the empire look momentarily fallible. Rome did not tolerate fallibility. It preferred inevitability. So when such a queen was captured, Rome seized the opportunity to correct the narrative. Her defeat became proof that independence was unstable. Her humiliation reinforced the idea that sovereignty outside Rome wasn't just doomed, it was embarrassing. These punishments were never impulsive. They were deliberate, carefully designed lessons delivered in chains. Rome wanted other rulers to watch and understand without needing further explanation. Fear was never admitted, but it was always present. Fear that authority could exist independently. Fear that loyalty might survive conquest. Fear that someone, somewhere, might watch a queen resist Rome and think, maybe we could too. Rome didn't punish queens because they lost. It punished them because they had ruled, and ruled well. Capture was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of the paperwork. The war might be over, cities burned and armies scattered, but Rome was only getting started. Rome never rushed consequences. It preferred to savor them. Once taken alive, a queen stopped being a battlefield reality and became a scheduled event. She was no longer a combatant. She was an asset, and Rome did not waste assets. Captured queens were transported carefully, not gently, just carefully enough to ensure they arrived intact. You can't stage a public lesson if the lesson dies on the road. Guards were instructed to keep her alive, visible, and unmistakably defeated. This wasn't mercy, it was preparation. Time itself became a weapon. Weeks or months might pass between capture and punishment. During that silence, rumors spread. Was she alive? Was she dead? Would she paraded through Rome? Uncertainty did much of the work long before chains ever appeared. Meanwhile, Roman officials debated her purpose. Would she march in a triumph, be kept alive as leverage, quietly erased later? Rome loved options. For the queen, this waiting was its own punishment. No information, no control. She had once commanded armies, and now her future depended on men discussing her fate between wine cups and administrative complaints. Power reduced to absence. Rome had learned that swift executions created martyrs. Martyrs inspired songs and rebellions. Rome preferred something colder. A living queen suspended in uncertainty sent a stronger message. Resistance does not end cleanly. Her identity was dismantled piece by piece. Titles were ignored, royal status dismissed. She was no longer a ruler, just the woman, the captive, the barbarian. Language mattered. Rome rewrote her story before the public ever saw her. By the time she reappeared, whether in chains or silence, she was no longer presented as a leader who challenged Rome. She was proof that challenging Rome was a disastrous long-term strategy. Capture was never the conclusion. It was the setup. To modern ears, a triumph sounds celebratory. Applause, smiles, speeches. Rome's triumph was none of that. It was conquest turned into theater, designed by people who believed humiliation served the public good. Streets were cleared, temples opened, crowds gathered. At the center marched the spoils of war, treasure, weapons, exotic animals, and most importantly, defeated enemies who were still alive. For a captured queen, the triumph was the most carefully choreographed insult imaginable. She was paraded behind the victorious general, sometimes in chains, sometimes bound by symbols meant to remind everyone watching exactly where power truly lived. The entire arrangement was designed so no one could miss the point. She was no longer in control. The crowd didn't need instructions. They understood immediately. This was the moment for staring, for whispers, for quiet laughter, for remembering who always won. Rome relied on visual language more than speeches. The queen existed to provide contrast. She walked. The general rode. He was elevated, wrapped in purple, temporarily treated like something close to divine. She followed behind, on foot, reduced to motion without direction. The message was unmistakable. Power moved forward. Defeat trailed behind. Her appearance was deliberately foreign. Roman triumphs emphasized difference as much as victory. Unfamiliar clothing, strange jewelry, hairstyles that marked her as other. Every detail reinforced the idea that she came from a lesser world, one that had now been neatly absorbed into Roman order. Rome didn't just conquer land, it conquered stories. The crowd mattered. Rome could have punished her in private. It chose not to. A punishment unseen was a wasted opportunity. Tens of thousands of witnesses ensured the humiliation would travel far beyond the city. Travelers would repeat what they saw. Rumors would grow. Future rebels would picture her long before lifting a sword. Rome enjoyed that delay. Triumphs often occurred long after the fighting ended. By then, the queen had spent months waiting, aware of what was coming, unable to prevent it. Anticipation sharpened the cruelty. Rome did not shout during triumphs. It didn't need to. Silence, chains, and contrast carried the message more effectively than noise ever could. Her role was simple: exist as proof of inevitability. By the time the procession ended, the lesson had already been delivered. Everything afterward was administration. Rome understood something essential about power. Victory wasn't complete until perception was reshaped, and nothing reshaped perception faster than clothing. What a captured queen wore during her punishment was never accidental. It was costume design for an empire that treated humiliation as a craft. Women who once appeared in garments heavy with authority were stripped of everything that made them look like rulers. What remained was carefully chosen, exotic enough to mark her as foreign, elaborate enough to attract attention, unfamiliar enough to invite mockery. Rome wanted difference noticed first, dignity second, humanity much later. This wasn't about comfort, it was about contrast. Spectators were meant to compare her appearance with the victorious general towering above her in ceremonial purple. One represented order and civilization, the other represented chaos that had been corrected. Rome loved visual metaphors it didn't have to explain. Even jewelry mattered. Objects that once signaled power were reduced to curiosities. Necklaces became trophies. Crowns became props. Sometimes queens were allowed to wear symbols of their former authority, not out of respect, but because seeing power emptied of meaning was more satisfying than seeing it removed entirely. Humiliation worked best when it reminded everyone what had been lost. The crowd noticed everything. Whispers traveled quickly. Comparisons followed. Someone always remarked on what she used to be. Rome relied on that reaction. It outsourced part of the punishment to public opinion. There was a deeper message woven into the fabric itself. By emphasizing her foreignness, Rome reinforced the idea that her rule had never truly belonged in the world of power. Her authority was framed as an oddity, not a system. Rome didn't need to say she was unfit to rule. Her appearance suggested it. For the queen, the effect was devastating. Clothing is identity. Being forced into garments that redefined you before thousands meant your past was rewritten in real time. She was no longer seen as a ruler who lost a war. She became a spectacle who never should have ruled at all. Rome didn't need words. The fabric spoke clearly enough. And when Rome wanted to make the point absolute, it added children. Not by accident, not as collateral damage, as design. Captured queens were sometimes paraded alongside their children. This wasn't done only out of cruelty, though cruelty was present, but out of calculation. Rome understood that nothing communicates total victory like control over the future. A queen without heirs could still inspire resistance. A queen standing beside children in chains represented finality. To Roman spectators, the message was brutal and clear. Not only had the ruler been defeated, the bloodline had been neutralized. No avengers waiting, no heirs growing beyond Rome's reach. The story ended here, in the street, in front of everyone. Rome liked clean endings. The presence of children also reshaped the narrative in a specific way, not toward sympathy, but toward inevitability. A woman dragging her children through humiliation was no longer framed as defiant. She became tragic, someone whose resistance had failed not only herself, but those who depended on her. Rome loved that framing. It shifted blame away from the empire and placed it squarely on the defeated ruler. The audience wasn't encouraged to think, how cruel. They were encouraged to think, this is what happens when you resist. For the queen, this was often the sharpest edge of punishment. Losing authority was one thing. Watching her children become props in Rome's performance was another. Rome didn't just conquer territories, it invaded families and repurposed them as warnings. The children were not always killed. Some were absorbed into Roman households, some vanished into obscurity, some were kept alive as leverage against future rebellions. Rome preferred control to bloodshed whenever possible. But survival didn't mean freedom. Raised, Romanized, renamed, separated from their origins, the queen's legacy dissolved quietly. Whatever she had built would not continue in recognizable form. Rome didn't just end reigns, it redesigned futures. To Rome, this was efficiency. To history, it was chilling. The empire understood a truth most conquerors eventually learn. To truly defeat a ruler, you don't just destroy the throne, you erase the line that could ever reclaim it. When Rome allowed a captured queen to live, it wasn't mercy, it was strategy. Survival was often the most efficient way to extend punishment indefinitely. A dead queen could inspire rebellion, a live one could suppress it. Rome understood optics. A queen breathing, visible, and thoroughly powerless sent a stronger message than execution ever could. Her people couldn't rally around a martyr if their former ruler was still alive, especially if she was seen imprisoned, paraded, or reduced to a name spoken only in whispers. Hope fades faster when resistance is visibly broken. So some queens were kept alive deliberately, housed in guarded residences, temples, or prisons where every movement was monitored and every interaction filtered. They were fed, clothed, and medically maintained just enough to remain functional. Not honored captives, preserved warnings. The cruelty was subtle. No crowds, no cheers, just endless days without authority, purpose, or agency. Rome understood that rulers accustomed to command did not need chains to feel imprisoned. Silence worked just as well. From Rome's perspective, this was good governance. A living queen could be referenced during negotiations. Her existence could be mentioned casually to discourage ambition. She still alive was often enough to quiet would-be rebels who remembered how her resistance ended. And if she ever stopped being useful, Rome was adaptable. Survival also allowed Rome to reshape her story. Over time, the queen became less a ruler and more a rumor. Roman monarchs recast her as reckless, misguided, or doomed by ambition. The longer she lived under Roman control, the easier it became to argue that her rule had always been unstable. From her perspective, survival meant slow erasure. Each day removed another layer of identity. No court, no authority, no future. Only memory, carefully managed by Rome.
No authority, no voice, only existence without influence. Rome did not need to torture her body. It let time handle the punishment. For an empire obsessed with control, the most satisfying sentence was not death. It was watching power dissolve, quietly, patiently, one ordinary day at a time. Roman captivity was rarely about iron bars or dramatic dungeons. That would have been too obvious. For captured queens, imprisonment was subtler and far more effective. Rome didn't simply lock them away, it removed everything that had ever made them dangerous. A queen in captivity was not treated like a criminal, she was treated like an inconvenience, contained politely, managed carefully. She might live in a guarded villa, a temple complex, or a monitored residence instead of a cell. From the outside, it could almost look comfortable. That was intentional. Rome understood that visible comfort softened outrage. A queen who was alive, fed, and housed allowed the empire to claim moral restraint while quietly dismantling her authority. No chains were necessary once no one listened to her anymore. The real prison was isolation. Queens were separated from supporters, advisors, and anyone who could remind them of who they had once been. Communication was filtered, visitors were screened, letters vanished without explanation. Rome rarely banned contact outright, it simply ensured nothing meaningful survived the process. Then there was routine, endless, dull, carefully regulated routine. No decisions to make, no orders to give, no audience. For someone shaped by command, routine became erosion. Each day stripped away relevance. Each repetition made the past feel further away. Rome also understood uncertainty. Queens were almost never told how long they would be held. Days blurred into months, months faded into years. The future existed only as an abstract administrative possibility discussed somewhere else by men who never intended to include her. Occasionally, a Roman official would visit, not to negotiate, not to threaten, but to observe, to remind her that Rome remembered she existed and that Rome alone decided when she would stop existing. This was not mercy, it was management. Rome preferred queens alive but inert, visible but silent, remembered but powerless. A living ruler without authority was proof that Roman dominance extended beyond battlefields and into identity itself. And to the outside world, the message was reinforced quietly. Resistance does not always end in death. Sometimes it ends with years spent in a comfortable room where nothing you say matters. To Rome, this was elegant punishment. No blood, no spectacle, just control applied slowly, relentlessly, and with impeccable organization. Time was one of Rome's favorite weapons. Not speed, not urgency, time. The empire understood that uncertainty could grind a person down more effectively than chains ever could. So plans were rarely announced, execution was not scheduled, release was not discussed. There was no calendar, no countdown, no sense of progress, just days that felt indistinguishable from one another. Rome believed clarity was a privilege. Defeated rulers had not earned it. From Rome's perspective, this was excellent policy. A queen who did not know her fate could not plan, she could not hope properly, she could not prepare herself emotionally for anything specific. Hope without direction becomes anxiety, and anxiety is exhausting. Rome outsourced much of its punishment to the human mind. Some queens waited months, others waited years. A few waited long enough that their names faded from conversation, their rebellions reduced to footnotes, their existence remembered only by guards rotating shifts and administrators filing reports. Rome had patience. Empires always do. It also valued flexibility. A living queen might be useful today and inconvenient tomorrow. If her people stirred, her survival could be mentioned casually, as reassurance or warning. If political winds shifted, her execution could be delayed indefinitely. Rome liked options. Certainty livid them. The uncertainty spread outward as well. Other rulers heard rumors. She was alive. She was dead. She was in Rome. Confusion followed. Fear followed faster. Rome did not clarify. Ambiguity did the work beautifully. For the queen, this was perhaps the cruelest phase. Power was already gone. Now time itself slipped away. Days lost meaning. Years passed without milestones. Waiting became existence. Rome did not take her life. It took her future and refused to explain why. Occasionally, hope resurfaced. A new governor, a new emperor, a policy change. Perhaps mercy would come. Rome allowed those thoughts to linger just long enough to be extinguished quietly by silence. The empire did not rush punishment because it didn't need to. It had learned something fundamental. When you control the timeline, you control the person. So the queen waited, and waited, and waited. Rome believed the most effective punishment was not knowing when the story ended. Popular imagination favors executions that are loud, theatrical, and soaked in spectacle. Rome, however, was a practical empire. When it finally ended a captured queen's life, drama was not necessary. The performance had already happened. The lesson had already been delivered. What remained was administration. Most executions of captured queens were private. No crowds, no speeches, no emotional closure. Rome had already extracted everything it needed through triumphs, rumors, and years of captivity. There was no need to repeat the message. Repetition risked sympathy, and Rome disliked sympathy almost as much as rebellion. Execution, when it occurred, was handled quietly, inside prisons or controlled residences. Strangulation was common, efficient, silent. It left no public remains to inspire devotion. Rome preferred methods that did not generate stories. A storyless death was a successful death. Timing mattered. Executions rarely followed capture quickly. They were delayed until every political benefit had been extracted. The queen lived as long as she remained useful. Once she became irrelevant, the empire moved on with administrative calm. From Rome's point of view, this was restraint. The empire liked to imagine itself rational, civilized, above emotional violence. A loud execution would have suggested anger. Rome preferred inevitability. This is simply how things conclude, the silence implied. For the queen, the end arrived without ceremony. No final speech, no dramatic resistance, no chance to reclaim dignity. Just the realization that the waiting was over, and Rome had decided she was no longer necessary. For the outside world, the lack of drama mattered. There was no public moment to mark the end, no clear conclusion, only rumors, silence, and gradual forgetting. Rome understood that forgetting was often more powerful than fear. Execution was never the finale. It was paperwork completed. By the time the queen was gone, her authority had already been dismantled, her story rewritten, her memory softened into something manageable. Rome did not need her alive or dead, it only needed her irrelevant. When that condition was met, the file was closed. Rome separated spectacle from consequence. Applause came first, silence followed later. By the time a captured queen was executed, the crowd had gone home, the banners were taken down, and the empire had already moved on to its next victory. This was policy, not accident. Public punishment was for education, death was for closure. Crowds were unpredictable, sympathy was dangerous. A queen killed before witnesses risked becoming the one thing Rome feared most, a martyr. Rome preferred endings that produced paperwork, not legends. So the execution happened after celebration ended, after memory faded, after interest disappeared, quietly, efficiently, without witnesses who might care. That was how Rome finished the story.
To the Roman public, the queen simply vanished. One day, her name was whispered during the triumph. The next, it was no longer mentioned at all. Silence replaced outrage. Silence replaced curiosity. Rome trusted silence to do what violence could not. The delay served another purpose. It created emotional distance. By the time death arrived, the queen had already been reduced to an abstract idea. No longer a living figure walking through the streets in chains, she became a rumor, a footnote, a problem that had already been handled. Executing her at that point felt less like cruelty and more like closing a chapter everyone had stopped reading. Rome also benefited diplomatically. Executing a queen immediately risked backlash from allies, relatives, and dependent kingdoms. Waiting allowed tensions to cool. By the time death occurred, objections had lost urgency. Rome was very good at letting outrage expire on its own. For the queen, this timing added one final cruelty. The end came not at the height of attention, but after isolation, waiting, and erasure. There was no dramatic conclusion, only the quiet realization that Rome had finished using her. Rome did not want its enemies remembered at their strongest. It wanted them remembered at their weakest, or not remembered at all. And so the queen died not as a ruler, not as a rebel, not even as a symbol. She died after the applause, when no one was listening. From Rome's perspective, that was exactly the point. But killing a queen was not always necessary. Sometimes it was inefficient. The most thorough punishment was not death, but disappearance. Rome had a talent for making people vanish without ever leaving a body behind. Erasure was subtle. It required no chains, no guards, no witnesses. It required scribes. Roman historians, poets, and officials controlled the narrative, and they used that power carefully. Queens who had once commanded armies were reduced to brief mentions, distorted anecdotes, or vague warnings about dangerous women. Their names were misspelled, minimized, or omitted entirely. Rome did not deny that these queens existed, it simply ensured they did not matter.
This was deliberate. Rome understood that memory is power. If people remember a ruler clearly, they may remember why they followed her. If they forget her, loyalty dissolves on its own. Forgetting required no troops. In some cases, queens were absorbed into Roman life so quietly that history lost track of them altogether. They were renamed, reassigned, married off, converted into polite footnotes living under supervision. Official records stopped calling them queens. They became wives, daughters, or foreign women, stripped of the titles that once made them dangerous. Even when remembered, their personalities were rewritten. Leadership became arrogance. Strategy became recklessness. Resistance became hysteria. Roman writers rarely described these women as capable rulers. That would have suggested Rome faced legitimate opposition. Instead, they were portrayed as emotional, impulsive, or doomed by their own ambition, the ancient equivalent of saying, "This was never going to work anyway." Rome's history did not shout, it whispered. Over time, those whispers became accepted truth, and the most effective part was how natural the absence felt. No monuments, no celebrations, no names carved in stone. Just silence. For the queen, this punishment extended beyond death. Even her memory was no longer hers. She did not just lose her throne, her freedom, or her life, she lost her place in time. Rome did not always destroy its enemies. Sometimes it simply edited them out. And for an empire obsessed with permanence, that was the ultimate victory. Rome did not leave history to chance. It employed writers, and Roman writers, knowingly or not, were among the empire's most effective executioners. Once a queen had been defeated, humiliated, imprisoned, erased, or quietly killed, they finished the work. They did not need chains. They had parchment, and parchment lasts longer than fear. These writers did not present queens as serious threats. That would have implied Rome faced real danger. Instead, they turned them into cautionary tales. Courage became recklessness, skill became manipulation, resistance became hysteria. Rome did not argue with these women. They caricatured them. With calm language and intellectual distance, Roman authors positioned themselves as rational observers describing irrational figures. The implication was clear. Rome was reason, resistance was madness. Even praise, when it appeared, was poisonous. A queen might be described as brave, but only to emphasize how tragic her inevitable failure was. Clever, but misguided. Strong, but unnatural. Compliments designed to collapse into inevitability. Centuries later, the effect remained. These queens were no longer remembered as rulers who challenged Rome. They were remembered as mistakes that proved Rome correct. Rome understood something essential. Killing a ruler ends resistance in the present. Writing about them incorrectly prevents resistance in the future. Soldiers and officials decided a queen's fate, but historians ensured she never recovered from it. She did not just lose her kingdom, she lost her reputation, and in Rome's empire, that loss was permanent. Captured queens were never punished for their own sake. That would have been inefficient. They were punished for everyone else. Every chain, every parade, every carefully timed disappearance was aimed outward. The queen was only the delivery system. Empires survive on reputation. Rome knew this. Its armies were powerful, but its greatest weapon was expectation. Kingdoms surrendered not only because Rome might win, but because Rome was expected to win. When other rulers watched a Roman triumph, they were not meant to feel curiosity, they were meant to calculate. If I resist, this is how it ends. Not quickly, not cleanly, but slowly, publicly, and with paperwork. Rome understood that fear works best when it looks organized. Random brutality creates chaos. Systematic punishment creates obedience. The fate of captured queens was not improvised cruelty. It was policy dressed as inevitability. Status offered no protection. Royal blood bought no mercy. Titles did not soften outcomes. They made punishment worse. The higher a ruler stood, the longer Rome took dismantling them. And the message traveled.
Merchants carried stories, diplomats whispered details, writers refined the narrative just enough to make resistance sound foolish. Rome did not need to threaten, it let the example speak. Even Rome's allies understood the warning. Loyalty was rewarded, independence was not. Rome rarely said, "Obey us." It said, "Look what happened to her." And over time, this became normal. When another ruler fell, people no longer asked what Rome would do. They asked how long it would take.
Rome succeeded because it made domination feel predictable, and predictability feels permanent. So when Rome punished captured queens, it was not acting out of cruelty alone, it was maintaining an image, one that stretched far beyond the empire's borders and long past the queen's lifetime. She suffered, but the lesson was never meant for her. In the end, Rome did not punish captured queens because they were weak. Rome punished them because they were dangerous, even after defeat. A queen represented an idea Rome could never fully control, authority that did not originate in Rome and did not require Roman approval. Empires can tolerate enemies, they can tolerate rebels. What they struggle with are alternatives. A ruling queen embodied the uncomfortable possibility that power could exist outside Rome's carefully managed hierarchy. She had ruled without Roman law, Roman gods, Roman armies, or Roman paperwork. People had followed her willingly. That fact alone was unsettling enough to warrant correction. Rome was not insecure, but it was thorough. It did not like loose ends, unresolved symbols, or lingering doubts. A captured queen was all three. Leaving her untreated, unprocessed, or insufficiently humiliated risked inspiring the wrong conclusions. Rome preferred its lessons unmistakable. So it dismantled queens piece by piece. First authority, then dignity, then time, then memory. Rome did not rush. It did not need to. It had centuries to reinforce the same message again and again. Resist, and you will not simply lose. You will be displayed, delayed, erased, and rewritten. And here is the quiet irony. Rome's harsh treatment of captured queens reveals just how seriously it took them. Empires do not waste energy humiliating insignificant opponents. They reserve that effort for figures who might otherwise be remembered as legitimate alternatives. Queens were punished so carefully because they mattered. Even Rome's historians betrayed this fear. The need to belittle, distort, and diminish these women long after their deaths suggests anxiety, not confidence. Rome wanted future generations to believe these queens were inevitable failures, not leaders who nearly succeeded. And yet, we still talk about them. Despite Rome's best efforts, their stories survived, fragmented, distorted, incomplete, but alive. Each remembered queen represents a crack in Rome's narrative of inevitability, proof that resistance once existed and was strong enough to worry the most powerful empire of its time. Rome won the wars, Rome controlled the records, but Rome never fully controlled memory. And perhaps that is the final failure, because an empire that fears how its enemies might be remembered reveals something deeply human beneath all that marble and law. Even Rome was afraid of being challenged. Medieval London did not create crime, but it certainly made it comfortable. By the 13th and 14th centuries, the city was bursting at the seams, with perhaps 80,000 people packed inside old Roman walls never designed for so many bodies, carts, animals, and ambitions. Streets were narrow, crooked, and often unnamed. Houses leaned outward as each new floor was added, blocking sunlight and trapping smells. If you were looking for order, light, or personal space, you chose the wrong century. Most Londoners lived and worked in the same cramped building. A butcher slept above his shop. An alewife brewed, served, and raised children in the same smoky room. At night, shutters closed, candles flickered, and entire neighborhoods sank into darkness. There were no streetlights. Moonlight was a luxury. Shadows were everywhere, and they were excellent accomplices. Crime thrived because opportunity was constant. Crowded markets meant distracted customers. Pilgrims and foreign merchants arrived daily with purses full of coin and no idea where they were going. Taverns spilled drunk men into the streets after curfew. Apprentices slept 10 to a room. Servants carried goods through alleys barely wide enough for 2 shoulders. If you wanted to steal, you did not need skill, you needed patience. London's layout did little to help law enforcement. The city was divided into wards, each responsible for its own policing. That policing consisted mostly of unpaid local men doing night watch duty with staves and lanterns, assuming they stayed awake. They were neighbors, not professionals, and they knew exactly who lived where, which made enforcing the law awkward. Arresting a stranger was easy. Arresting your cousin was another matter entirely. Then there was the river. The Thames was London's highway, dumping ground, and escape route all in one. Stolen goods vanished onto boats. Bodies occasionally did too. The docks drew sailors, laborers, prostitutes, thieves, and gamblers in equal measure. Where money moved, crime followed. London was also a magnet. If you were poor, desperate, or running from something, the city promised work, anonymity, and chaos. For many, it delivered only hunger and temptation. Theft was not always a career choice. Often, it was a short-term survival strategy that went very wrong. In short, medieval London was noisy, filthy, overcrowded, poorly lidded, and loosely policed. It was not a city designed to prevent crime. It was a city that quietly invited it in, shut the door, and pretended not to notice until someone screamed. If medieval London had a background noise, it was the rustle of fingers where they didn't belong. Pickpocketing was the most common crime in the city, and also the hardest to stop. Crowds were everywhere. Markets, churchyards, processions, executions, and festivals, all packing people shoulder to shoulder. Where bodies pressed together, hands wandered. The typical target was not a wealthy noble, it was the ordinary man who carried his entire fortune on his belt. Coins were kept in purses tied with cords and worn openly for convenience and necessity. There were no banks for daily wages. If you earned money, you carried it, and if you carried it, someone noticed. Cut purses specialized in removing those purses with small knives, slicing cords cleanly and quietly. The victim often felt nothing until the weight was gone. Some thieves worked alone, but many operated in groups. One person bumped the target, another shouted or spilled ale, a third made the cut. By the time confusion settled, the purse had already changed hands twice. Children were frequently involved. Orphans and runaways learned quickly that small hands raised less suspicion. They were trained to watch for distracted merchants, drunk sailors, or pilgrims staring at relics instead of their belongings. If caught, children might be beaten or branded, but many judges hesitated to hang them. This made them useful tools in a brutal system. Markets were prime hunting grounds. Buyers focused on haggling, sellers focused on profit, thieves focused on both. Church crowds were equally tempting. Piety did not protect your purse, and sermons about sin did little to discourage someone who hadn't eaten in days. Punishment for theft depended on value. Small thefts might result in fines, time in the stocks, or whipping. Larger sums meant branding on the cheek or forehead, marking the thief forever. Repeat offenders faced mutilation, usually the loss of an ear or hand. Hanging waited at the end of the path, visible to everyone and carefully remembered. Public shame was part of the system. Thieves were paraded through streets, mocked, spat on, and sometimes pelted with rotten food. The goal was deterrence through humiliation, though it often created hardened criminals instead. Despite this, pickpocketing never disappeared. It adapted. Thieves learned new tricks. Londoners learned to clutch their purses tighter. The city accepted it as part of daily life, like mud on boots or smoke in the air. In medieval London, losing your money was not shocking, it was expected. Taverns were where medieval London went to relax, which is precisely where they were where trouble gathered. Ale was cheap, safer than water, and consumed in heroic quantities. By sunset, many taverns were already loud. By nightfall, they were dangerous. Drink loosened tongues, blurred loyalties, and turned small insults into matters of honor that absolutely required fists. Most tavern brawls began over nothing worth remembering: a spilled cup, a disputed dice throw, a perceived insult to a woman who may or may not have been present. Once voices rose, others joined quickly, out of loyalty, boredom, or the simple joy of chaos.
Benches became weapons. Tankards flew. Knives appeared faster than anyone later admitted. Weapons were common. Men carried daggers as tools as much as arms. Apprentices were forbidden by law from carrying swords, which did not stop them. Sailors brought knives from the docks. Even a broken bottle or a fire poker could become lethal. A brawl that started with shouting could end with a body on the floor and no clear idea of who struck the final blow. Street violence often followed. When taverns closed at curfew, drunk patrons spilled into alleys already dark and narrow. Fights continued outside, sometimes drawing in watchmen who were just as likely to be attacked as assisted. Night watch patrols were poorly paid and poorly trained. Many preferred to shout warnings from a distance rather than intervene directly. The law treated violence seriously but unevenly. If no one died, punishments ranged from fines to time in the pillory. Serious injuries could lead to imprisonment. Homicide complicated matters. Killing in self-defense was theoretically excusable, but proving it was difficult. Witnesses were often drunk, biased, or conveniently absent. Guild rivalries also fueled violence. Apprentices from different trades clashed regularly, especially during festivals. Bakers fought butchers. Fishmongers fought just about everyone. These were not random fights. They were expressions of identity, loyalty, and long-standing grudges carried out with enthusiasm and very little planning. Authorities attempted crackdowns, imposing curfews and banning weapons in taverns, but enforcement was inconsistent. Tavern owners depended on rowdy customers. Watchmen depended on not getting stabbed. In the end, tavern violence was tolerated because it was familiar. As long as it stayed within certain bounds, London accepted bruises, broken bones, and the occasional corpse as the price of a city that drank together every night. Medieval London officially disapproved of prostitution while quietly relying on it. Brothels were considered a necessary evil, a way to prevent worse sins by channeling male desire into regulated spaces. The city did not ban them outright. Instead, it tried to control them, which meant accepting that sex work was part of urban life as long as it stayed where authorities could see it. Most legal brothels were concentrated in specific districts, especially Suffolk across the Thames. This area fell under different jurisdiction, conveniently outside the direct control of London's civic authorities. Brothels paid fees, followed rules, and submitted to inspections. Prostitutes were required to wear identifying clothing, so they could not be mistaken for honest women, a distinction that mattered deeply in court and on the street. Despite regulation, brothel raids were common. Officials periodically staged moral crackdowns, often during times of political unrest or religious pressure. These raids were less about ending prostitution and more about demonstrating authority. Women were arrested, fined, publicly shamed, or briefly imprisoned, then released back into the same system that had just punished them. Clients were rarely targeted. Men caught during raids were usually warned or ignored entirely unless they were clergy, married, or politically inconvenient. The burden of morality fell almost entirely on women, especially those without powerful protectors. Illegal brothels also thrived. Some operated out of taverns, bathhouses, or private homes. Others were little more than rooms rented for the night. These spaces lacked protection and were more vulnerable to violence, theft, and exploitation. Prostitutes in illegal establishments could be beaten, robbed, or arrested with little recourse. Sex-related crimes extended beyond prostitution. Adultery, fornication, and sodomy were all subject to punishment, though enforcement depended heavily on witnesses and reputation. Accusations could destroy lives even without proof. A woman's word carried less weight than a man's, and a poor woman's word barely registered at all. Punishments ranged from fines and public penance to imprisonment. In severe or repeated cases, banishment from the city was possible. Public shame was again the preferred weapon. Offenders were paraded, named, and marked as moral failures. Their reputations were permanently damaged.
Brothel raids gave the appearance of moral order while changing very little. The city needed sex workers, sailors needed distraction, and officials needed revenue. Crime, in this case, was not something medieval London wanted to eliminate, it simply wanted to manage it quietly, preferably without admitting how dependent it truly was. Theft in medieval London was not just a crime, it was a public spectacle waiting to happen. The city believed deeply in visible punishment. Justice was meant to be seen, remembered, and feared. If someone stole, the goal was not rehabilitation. Petty theft, such as stealing bread, tools, or clothing, was common, especially during hard winters or food shortages. Courts understood desperation, but rarely excused it. A first-time offender might face a fine or whipping. If they could not pay, which most could not, the punishment became physical. Pain replaced money as currency. Branding was especially feared. A hot iron pressed into the cheek, forehead, or hand marked a thief forever. The mark announced their crime to employers, neighbors, and strangers alike. Once branded, finding honest work became almost impossible, which quietly encouraged repeat offending. The system created the criminals it claimed to deter. More serious thefts led to mutilation. Ears were cut off, hands were severed. These punishments were legal, ritualized, and performed publicly. The crowd watched not only for entertainment, but for instruction. Children were brought along to learn consequences early. Execution waited at the far end of the scale. Hanging was the usual method, carried out at sites like Tyburn. Theft above a certain value or repeated offenses could send a person to the gallows. The threshold for a capital theft was low. A coat, a purse, or a few coins could be enough. Fear shaped daily behavior. Londoners locked chests, hid valuables, and traveled in groups. Shops installed shutters and bars. People memorized faces, especially those of known criminals. Rumors spread quickly, often exaggerating danger, turning strangers into threats. Yet public punishment also bred sympathy. Crowds sometimes prayed for the condemned. Occasionally they intervened, cutting down a hanging body early in hopes of survival. Executions were terrifying, but they were also communal events, blending justice, religion, and uneasy compassion. Authorities believed harsh punishment preserved order. In reality, it created a city tense with anxiety. Theft did not vanish, it adapted. Criminals became faster, quieter, more selective. Ordinary people learned to live alert, suspicious, and prepared to lose everything in a single careless moment. In medieval London, fear was not a side effect of crime, it was part of the system, carefully cultivated, publicly displayed, and deeply felt by everyone who walked the streets with something worth stealing. When the sun went down in medieval London, the city did not sleep so much as surrender. Darkness transformed familiar streets into uncertain territory. Without streetlights, only candles and hearth fires provided scattered points of glow, and most households extinguished them early to save money. The result was a city where shadows ruled and crimes multiplied. Night was when theft turned bold. Burglars targeted homes and shops, prying shutters, forcing doors, or slipping through unguarded windows. Even churches were not spared. Sacred spaces held valuable vessels, candles, and offerings, and thieves rarely worried about divine punishment when hunger or greed pressed harder. Sacrilege was illegal, but it was also profitable. The city relied on the night watch to maintain order. These watchmen were local men required to serve by obligation, not by desire. They were unpaid or poorly paid, poorly equipped, and often elderly or inexperienced. Armed with staves and lanterns, they patrolled wards in small groups, calling out the hours and watching for suspicious activity. In theory, in practice, many dozed, drank, or avoided confrontation. Challenging armed thieves in narrow alleys was dangerous, and there was little incentive to be brave. A wounded watchman received no compensation. A dead one received prayers. Thieves knew this and treated the watch as an inconvenience rather than a threat. Curfews were enforced unevenly. Bells signaled when lawful movement should stop, but taverns, brothels, and private gatherings ignored them regularly. Anyone caught outside after curfew risked punishment.
People could be questioned or detained, but enforcement depended on who they were. Respectable merchants passed more easily than servants or foreigners. Night concealed violence. Assaults, robberies, and murders were harder to investigate in darkness. Witnesses disappeared. Evidence vanished. Many cases went unsolved, recorded only as rumors or unexplained deaths. The river absorbed secrets sufficiently. The city attempted reforms, more watchmen, stricter curfews, better equipment. None solved the underlying problem. London was too large, too dark, and too crowded for effective nighttime control. For ordinary people, night meant risk. Doors were barred, windows shuttered, families huddled inside. Travel after dark was avoided unless necessary. Those who moved through the city at night did so with purpose, fear, or both. Daylight belonged to law and commerce. Night belonged to opportunity, desperation, and the quiet understanding that once darkness fell, help was uncertain and justice could wait until morning. Medieval London's prisons were not places of punishment in the modern sense. They were holding pens designed to keep bodies contained until a decision was made. Justice moved slowly, and while it did, prisoners waited in conditions often worse than the sentence itself. The most infamous prison was Newgate. Its reputation alone inspired fear. Prisoners paid for everything: food, bedding, chains, and even the removal of chains. Those with money lived slightly better. Those without it suffered. Hunger, filth, and disease were constant companions. Rats moved freely, so did lice. Debtors, thieves, murder suspects, and political prisoners were all mixed together. There was little separation by crime, age, or gender. Violence inside prisons was common, and guards often looked the other way unless bribed. Survival depended on connections, strength, or luck. Justice relied heavily on accusation and testimony. Investigations were brief. Evidence was often circumstantial. Juries were composed of local men who might already know the accused or the victim. Reputation mattered enormously. A known troublemaker was easier to condemn than a respected guild member, regardless of facts. Trials could be swift once they began, but reaching that point took time. Prisoners waited weeks or months, unsure whether they would be fined, maimed, banished, or killed. Anxiety was part of the punishment. Confessions were sometimes encouraged through pressure rather than force, though outright torture was rare in England compared to elsewhere. Not all justice was harsh. Courts occasionally showed mercy, especially to first-time offenders or those with community support. Pardons were possible, often granted during religious festivals or royal celebrations. Charity existed alongside cruelty, though unpredictably. Public trust in justice was fragile. Some saw courts as necessary protectors. Others saw them as tools of the powerful. Corruption was an open secret. Bribes could soften sentences. Influence could erase charges. The poor understood that law was not blind. It looked very closely at status. Prisons embodied this imbalance. They punished poverty as much as crime. For many, the mere act of being imprisoned destroyed livelihood, family, and future, regardless of outcome. Justice was not only about guilt or innocence, it was about endurance. If one survived the waiting, the filth, and the fear, whatever sentence followed might almost feel like a conclusion rather than a beginning. Execution day in medieval London was not quiet, solemn, or private. It was loud, crowded, and disturbingly festive. When word spread that someone was to hang, people came out in force. Vendors sold food, children climbed for a better view. What was meant to inspire fear often slid into entertainment. Most executions took place at established sites, such as Tyburn, just outside the city. Condemned prisoners were marched through the streets, sometimes tied to a hurdle or cart, giving the crowd time to gather. This procession transformed punishment into a moral lesson on display, a final warning delivered step by step. Hanging was the usual method, especially for thieves. It was simple, cheap, and public. Death was not always quick. Short drops meant slow strangulation. The crowd watched everything.
Some jeered, others prayed, a few shouted encouragement, hoping the condemned would repent loudly enough to save their soul, if not their body. Executions reinforced social order. Criminals were shown as cautionary examples, not tragic figures. Yet sympathy often crept in. Many condemned were young, poor, or clearly terrified. Mothers fainted, friends wept. Sometimes the crowd intervened, pulling on legs to hasten death, an act of grim mercy. Bodies were sometimes left hanging for hours or days, especially in notorious cases. This was meant to extend the lesson. Rotting corpses marked the boundary between law and chaos. Londoners learned where not to step, literally and morally. Not all executions were equal. Nobles convicted of serious crimes might be beheaded instead, a cleaner, faster death. Status followed you to the scaffold. Even in death, hierarchy mattered. Religious rituals softened the moment. Priests offered prayers, confessions were encouraged. A well-spoken final speech could earn respect or forgiveness. A defiant one could earn hatred. Last words mattered because they were remembered, repeated, and sometimes written down. Execution days revealed a contradiction at the heart of medieval justice. The city wanted fear, order, and obedience, but it also craved drama. Punishment was law, theater, and morality play, combined. For Londoners, the gallows were not abstract threats. They were familiar landmarks. Everyone knew someone who had stood there waiting. Crime ended lives publicly, loudly, and in full view, ensuring no one forgot what the city demanded in return for order. Crime in medieval London was not an interruption to daily life. It was woven into it. People did not expect safety in the modern sense. They expected risk, loss, and the constant need to stay alert. Survival meant adapting rather than resisting. Londoners learned habits early. Purses were tied tightly and worn under clothing when possible. Doors were barred at dusk. Neighbors listened for unfamiliar footsteps. Strangers were watched carefully, especially at markets and taverns. Trust existed, but it was cautious and conditional. Communities policed themselves as much as the law did. Reputation mattered. A known thief found doors closed and work scarce. Gossip spread faster than official warnings. At the same time, communities protected their own. Witnesses sometimes lied. Juries hesitated to condemn neighbors they knew, even when guilt was obvious. Justice bent under familiarity. Fear shaped social behavior. Women avoided streets alone. Merchants traveled in groups. Apprentices learned which taverns were safest and which to leave before nightfall. Parents warned children not with abstract morals, but with real examples. Everyone knew the names of the executed. Everyone knew where it happened. Religion framed crime as sin, but hunger often framed it as necessity. Many criminals did not see themselves as villains. They were laborers without work, servants dismissed without wages, migrants without connections. London attracted them with promise and punished them for believing it. Authorities understood this tension but rarely addressed its causes. Harsh punishment was easier than reform. Public executions were cheaper than welfare. The city preferred fear over solutions, spectacle over stability. Despite everything, London endured. Trade continued. Taverns stayed full. Markets reopened the day after executions. Crime did not destroy the city, it shaped it. The constant negotiation between danger and order forged a population resilient, suspicious, and deeply practical. Medieval Londoners lived knowing the rules could protect them one day and destroy them the next. Law was visible, violence was public, and survival depended on awareness more than innocence. Crime was not an anomaly. It was a consequence of density, poverty, opportunity, and human nature playing out in narrow streets beneath leaning houses, watched by neighbors who knew exactly how fragile safety really was. Versing was born into power long before he ever imagined rebellion. His people, the Ivuri, were not a minor tribe.
Tucked away in forests and hills, the Arvuri were one of the dominant powers of central Gaul, wealthy, militarily respected, and deeply proud of their lineage. To be born into Arverian nobility meant growing up surrounded by authority, expectation, and constant reminders of who you were supposed to become.
Vercingetorix's family stood near the top of this hierarchy. His father, Celtillus, was no ordinary chieftain. He was influential enough to aspire to kingship, a dangerous ambition in a Gallic world that distrusted centralized power. Among the Arvuri, leadership was shared, negotiated, and constantly contested. A man who reached too high risked being accused of tyranny by his own people. From early childhood, Vercingetorix would have been immersed in a warrior aristocracy. Status was proven through courage, generosity, and loyalty, not paperwork or titles. Young boys of noble families were raised to fight, ride, hunt, and endure pain without complaint. Strength was admired, but restraint mattered too. A future leader needed discipline as much as ferocity. He grew up hearing the names of ancestors spoken with reverence, their deeds recited during feasts where meat was carved publicly and honor was distributed alongside food. These gatherings were not just celebrations, they were lessons. Every story reinforced the idea that nobility carried obligation. You defended your people, upheld tradition, and remembered slights. The Arvuri world was intensely political. Alliances shifted, rival clans watched one another closely, and even within noble families, loyalty could fracture under pressure. Vercingetorix would have learned early that power was fragile, and admiration could turn to suspicion overnight. And then there was Rome, not yet an occupying force in his childhood, but a growing presence in stories, trade, and rumors. Rome was distant but looming, described as wealthy, disciplined, and dangerously organized. For a young noble, Rome was both curiosity and warning. Vercingetorix's birth placed him inside a system that valued strength, memory, and independence above all else. He was raised not to obey quietly, but to lead loudly. That identity, forged before he ever held a sword in battle, would shape every choice he made once loyalty, survival, and revenge collided. He grew up in a world where memory mattered more than ink. Among the Arvuri, writing existed but was not trusted with the soul of the people. Laws, history, and identity were carried by voices, not pages. To forget was to lose who you were. To remember was a sacred duty. As a child, Vercingetorix listened more than he read. Elders recited genealogies stretching back generations, naming warriors, chiefs, and rivals long dead but still present in story. These were not distant legends, they were reminders that the living were temporary custodians of a much older legacy. Every name carried expectations. Bards held enormous influence. They were historians, moral judges, and entertainers all at once. At feasts, they sang of victories and betrayals, praising generosity and mocking cowardice. Their words could elevate a man's reputation or quietly ruin it. Young nobles paid close attention. A future leader needed to understand how stories shaped power. Ritual feasts served as classrooms. Meat was divided according to rank, and every portion was symbolic. Who received the choicest cut was never accidental. Children learned hierarchy without being lectured. They watched, remembered, and absorbed the rules. Mistakes were noticed. Silence taught more than correction. Druids also shaped education, though indirectly. They were keepers of religious law and cosmic order, respected and feared. Noble children were exposed to their teachings through ritual, taboo, and example, rather than formal instruction. The idea that the world was governed by unseen balances took root early. Training the mind mattered as much as training the body. Boys memorized long speeches, poems, and legal precedents, sharpening memory and discipline. A leader who could not recall promises, insults, or alliances was unfit to rule. Rome, by contrast, wrote everything down: contracts, orders, laws. Gallic elites viewed this with suspicion. Writing fixed power in ways that tradition resisted. For Vercingetorix, oral culture reinforced flexibility, loyalty, and personal honor over abstract authority. By adolescence, Vercingetorix was already being shaped by a culture that believed words could bind warriors and that memory itself was a weapon. Long before he would face Roman legions, he learned to fight battles of narrative, identity, and meaning. Those lessons would prove just as important as any sword. Among the Arvuri, childhood did not last long. By the time Vercingetorix could run, he was already being measured for the life of a warrior. Strength, endurance, and courage were not optional traits, they were social currency. A noble boy who could not fight was not merely weak, he was a liability. Physical training began early and was constant. Boys wrestled, raced, and hunted in the forests and hills of central Gaul. These activities were not games, they taught balance, pain tolerance, and teamwork. Injuries were expected and complaints discouraged. Endurance earned respect long before adulthood. Weapons were introduced gradually, first spears and shields, then swords. Young nobles practiced formation fighting, learning how to hold ground, protect comrades, and advance under pressure. Individual bravery mattered, but loyalty mattered more. A warrior who broke ranks endangered everyone. Hunting doubled as military preparation. Tracking prey sharpened patience. The kill tested resolve. Feasts that followed reinforced generosity. A successful hunter was expected to share, not hoard. Reputation grew through giving, not keeping. They watched older warriors closely. Veterans bore scars openly, proof of survival and honor. Stories of past battles were retold endlessly, emphasizing moments of courage and betrayal alike. These stories were warnings as much as inspiration. Discipline was social rather than institutional. Shame enforced behavior more effectively than punishment. Cowardice was remembered, bravery celebrated. Public reputation followed a man everywhere, creating constant pressure to perform. Training also included ritual elements. Before battle or hunts, offerings were made, oaths were sworn. Warriors believed they were bound not only to each other, but to gods and ancestors who watched closely. Failure was not just personal, it was spiritual. Rome again appeared at the edges of these lessons. Roman soldiers were disciplined, relentless, and terrifyingly organized. Gallic warriors admired their strength, but despised their rigidity. To be Gallic was to value personal valor and freedom, even at a cost. By adolescence, Vercingetorix had already been shaped by a culture that believed words could bind warriors, and that memory itself was a weapon. Long before he would face Roman legions, he learned to fight battles of narrative, identity, and meaning. Those lessons would prove just as important as any sword. For Vercingetorix, the most formative lesson of his youth did not come from training or ritual, it came from watching power turn inward and devour itself. His father, Celtillus, was executed not by foreign enemies, but by fellow Gauls. That fact alone shaped everything that followed. Celtillus was a prominent Arvuri noble, influential enough to attempt what few dared, the restoration of kingship among his people. The Arvuri had once ruled widely, but memories of domination bred suspicion. Gallic elites feared any man who gathered too much authority, believing kingship invited tyranny and civil war. Whether Celtillus truly sought absolute power or merely greater unity is unclear. What mattered was perception. Rival nobles accused him of ambition, betrayal, and dangerous consolidation of influence. In a society that prized shared leadership, this was unforgivable. The punishment was public and brutal. Celtillus was executed by his own people, a deliberate act meant to warn others against similar aspirations. For the community, it was justice. For his family, it was devastation. Vercingetorix was still young, but old enough to understand what had happened. His father's name became dangerous to speak out loud.
Allies distanced themselves. The family's position collapsed overnight. Nobility did not guarantee protection. Loyalty was conditional. This moment taught Vercingetorix a lesson more powerful than any battle drill. Power without unity invites destruction. His father had not fallen to Rome. He had fallen to fear, jealousy, and fractured leadership. The execution also introduced a quiet, lasting bitterness. The same society that taught loyalty had betrayed one of its own. Honor proved fragile, justice proved political. From this point forward, Vercingetorix lived with contradiction. He was born to lead, yet leadership had destroyed his father. He was raised to trust his people, yet they had killed their own chief. Rome, distant but growing stronger, now loomed differently. Where Gallic unity had failed, Roman order endured. This contrast planted dangerous ideas. Perhaps the real enemy was not foreign domination, but internal division. Celtus's death did not immediately turn Vercingetorix into a rebel, but it stripped away innocence. It taught him that survival required more than courage. It required control of loyalty, narrative, and fear. That lesson stayed with him long after childhood ended, shaping how he would later unite tribes, punish dissent, and accept that rebellion, like leadership, demanded sacrifice. After the execution of Celtillus, Vercingetorix did not inherit his father's influence, he inherited his danger. The name that once commanded respect now carried suspicion. In a society where memory mattered, association alone could ruin a future. For a time, silence became his safest strategy. Sources are unclear about formal exile, but it is evident that Vercingetorix was pushed to the margins of power. He was no longer welcomed at councils. His family's voice faded. Survival required restraint. A young noble who spoke too boldly risked following his father's path. This period was quiet but formative. Without a public role, Vercingetorix learned to observe. He watched how leaders argued, how alliances shifted, how fear guided decisions more than honor. He learned who benefited from his father's death and who quietly regretted it. Isolation hardened him. Warrior culture valued action, yet he was forced into patience. This created an unusual balance. He remained trained for violence, but learned when not to use it. Many warriors never learned that distinction. He also gained exposure to wider Gaul. Moving beyond the Arverni heartland meant encountering other tribes, customs, and rivalries. Each group shared traditions, but differed in leadership styles and priorities. Unity was spoken of often, achieved rarely. Rome appeared more clearly during these years. Roman traders, envoys, and soldiers were no longer distant rumors. They were present, organized, and confident. Their alliances with certain Gallic elites created tension. Some chiefs admired Roman stability. Others resented Roman interference, but accepted Roman gold. Vercingetorix saw how Rome exploited division. It rewarded cooperation and punished resistance selectively. This strategy weakened Gaul without open war. The lesson was unmistakable. Silence also allowed grief to settle into resolve. His father's execution was no longer a shock. It became a reference point, a reminder of what fractured leadership cost and what fear-driven politics destroyed. By the end of this period, Vercingetorix was no longer simply a dispossessed noble. He was a careful observer of power, loyalty, and weakness. He had learned that survival required more than bravery. It required timing. This chapter of restraint would make his later actions seem sudden and explosive. In reality, rebellion had been forming quietly, shaped by years of watching Gaul undermine itself, while Rome waited patiently for the pieces to fall. As Vercingetorix moved into early adulthood, Rome stopped being an abstract threat and became a living system he could study. He watched Roman influence spread not through constant violence, but through discipline, infrastructure, and selective generosity. This fascinated and unsettled him in equal measure. Roman soldiers operated differently from Gallic warriors. They drilled constantly. They obeyed orders without debate. Their loyalty was institutional, not personal. Where Gallic leaders relied on reputation and persuasion, Roman commanders relied on structure. Vercingetorix recognized the strength in this even as he despised its rigidity. He likely encountered Roman auxiliaries and allied Gallic leaders who had adopted Roman customs. Latin word allies distanced themselves. The family's position collapsed overnight. Nobility did not guarantee protection. Loyalty was conditional. This moment taught Vercingetorix a lesson more powerful than any battle drill. Power without unity invites destruction. His father had not fallen to Rome, he had fallen to fear, jealousy, and fractured leadership. The execution also introduced a quiet, lasting bitterness. The same society that taught loyalty had betrayed one of its own. Honor proved fragile, justice proved political. From this point forward, Vercingetorix lived with contradiction. He was born to lead, yet leadership had destroyed his father. He was raised to trust his people, yet they had killed their own chief. Rome, distant but growing stronger, now loomed differently. Where Gallic unity had failed, Roman order endured. This contrast planted dangerous ideas. Perhaps the real enemy was not foreign domination, but internal division. Celtus's death did not immediately turn Vercingetorix into a rebel, but it stripped away innocence. It taught him that survival required more than courage. It required control of loyalty, narrative, and fear. That lesson stayed with him long after childhood ended, shaping how he would later unite tribes, punish dissent, and accept that rebellion, like leadership, demanded sacrifice. After the execution of Celtillus, Vercingetorix did not inherit his father's influence, he inherited his danger. The name that once commanded respect now carried suspicion. In a society where memory mattered, association alone could ruin a future. For a time, silence became his safest strategy. Sources are unclear about formal exile, but it is evident that Vercingetorix was pushed to the margins of power. He was no longer welcomed at councils, his family's voice faded. Survival required restraint. A young noble who spoke too boldly risked following his father's path. This period was quiet but formative. Without a public role, Vercingetorix learned to observe. He watched how leaders argued, how alliances shifted, how fear guided decisions more than honor. He learned who benefited from his father's death and who quietly regretted it. Isolation hardened him. Warrior culture valued action, yet he was forced into patience. This created an unusual balance. He remained trained for violence, but learned when not to use it. Many warriors never learned that distinction. He also gained exposure to wider Gaul. Moving beyond the Arverni heartland meant encountering other tribes, customs, and rivalries. Each group shared traditions, but differed in leadership styles and priorities. Unity was spoken of often, achieved rarely. Rome appeared more clearly during these years. Roman traders, envoys, and soldiers were no longer distant rumors. They were present, organized, and confident. Their alliances with certain Gallic elites created tension. Some chiefs admired Roman stability, others resented Roman interference but accepted Roman gold. Vercingetorix saw how Rome exploited division. It rewarded cooperation and punished resistance selectively. This strategy weakened Gaul without open war. The lesson was unmistakable. Silence also allowed grief to settle into resolve. His father's execution was no longer a shock, it became a reference point, a reminder of what fractured leadership cost and what fear-driven politics destroyed. By the end of this period, Vercingetorix was no longer simply a dispossessed noble, he was a careful observer of power, loyalty, and weakness. He had learned that survival required more than bravery, it required timing. This chapter of restraint would make his later actions seem sudden and explosive. In reality, rebellion had been forming quietly, shaped by years of watching Gaul undermine itself, while Rome waited patiently for the pieces to fall. As Vercingetorix moved into early adulthood, Rome stopped being an abstract threat and became a living system he could study. He watched Roman influence spread not through constant violence, but through discipline, infrastructure, and selective generosity. This fascinated and unsettled him in equal measure. Roman soldiers operated differently from Gallic warriors. They drilled constantly. They obeyed orders without debate. Their loyalty was institutional, not personal. Where Gallic leaders relied on reputation and persuasion, Roman commanders relied on structure. Vercingetorix recognized the strength in this even as he despised its rigidity. He likely encountered Roman auxiliaries and allied Gallic leaders who had adopted Roman customs. Latin words entered Gallic speech, Roman goods circulated widely, roads cut through tribal lands, forts appeared where none had existed before. These were not invasions in the dramatic sense, they were quiet assertions of permanence. Some Gallic nobles welcomed this. Roman alliance brought stability, trade, and prestige. Others resented it, but lacked unity to resist. Vercingetorix understood that Rome did not need to conquer Gaul immediately. It could wait while Gaul eroded from within. Importantly, Vercingetorix did not serve Rome in this period, unlike some Gallic leaders who fought as Roman allies. Meeting Roman legions head-on in traditional battle had failed too many times. Courage alone was not enough. Something harsher was required. Vercingetorix chose denial over confrontation. If Rome thrived on supply, order, and stability, then Gaul would become unstable by design. Crops would be destroyed, villages burned, and food denied, not just to Roman armies, but to the Gauls themselves. It was a strategy that demanded obedience and sacrifice on a scale Gaul had never attempted. This decision was deeply unpopular. Gallic identity was tied to land, harvest, and hospitality. Burning one's own fields felt like betrayal. Many chiefs hesitated. Some openly resisted the idea. Vercingetorix did not waver. Rome could rebuild. Gaul could not survive occupation. Enforcing this policy required authority bordering on tyranny. Communities that refused faced punishment. Livestock was seized. Leaders were threatened. Unity now had teeth. For the first time, resistance demanded more than enthusiasm. It demanded submission to strategy. This was the shadow of his father's lesson. Celtulus had reached too far without securing obedience. Vercingetorix would not repeat that mistake. Unity would be enforced, not requested. The moral weight of this choice was immense. Families watched their homes burn by Gallic hands. Hunger followed. Resentment simmered. Yet the alternative was Roman seizure, taxation, and permanent control. Vercingetorix framed destruction as temporary suffering for long-term survival. Rome underestimated this resolve. Roman commanders expected rebellion to fracture under pressure. Instead, they encountered scorched land and empty roads. Supply lines stretched thin, discipline strained. This moment marked the true beginning of Vercingetorix's rebellion. Even before battles were fought, he had transformed resistance from defiance into policy. Gaul was no longer reacting, it was shaping the battlefield. The cost was immense, but the choice was deliberate. Vercingetorix accepted that leadership meant being hated as much as followed. Survival required cruelty turned inward. By choosing fire over submission, he crossed a line few Gallic leaders dared approach. From this point forward, retreat was impossible. Only victory or annihilation remained. By the time open war loomed, the early life of Vercingetorix was already over, even if his greatest battles had yet to be fought. The boy raised among feasts, stories, and warrior games no longer existed. In his place stood a man shaped by betrayal, patience, and ruthless clarity. Everything that defined him had been forged before Caesar ever marched deep into Gaul. His noble birth taught him leadership carried obligation. Oral tradition taught him that memory outlived victory. Warrior training taught him endurance. His father's execution taught him that unity mattered more than honor. Exile taught him restraint. Rome taught him strategy. Fire taught him authority. Vercingetorix did not stumble into rebellion. He arrived at it deliberately. Unlike earlier Gallic leaders who rose in moments of panic or pride, Vercingetorix understood timing. He waited until fear outweighed comfort, until Roman presence felt permanent, until hesitation became more dangerous than resistance. When he finally acted, it felt sudden only to those who had not been watching.
This is what made him different. He did not promise easy triumph. He promised survival at a terrible price. He asked Gaul to suffer now to exist later. Many followed him not because they loved him, but because they believed him. His authority no longer came from blood alone, it came from coherence. He offered something rare in Gaul, direction in a land used to fragmentation that made him inevitable. Even his enemies sensed it. Roman sources describe him not as a barbarian chief acting on impulse, but as a commander capable of learning, adapting, and enforcing discipline. That reputation did not appear overnight. It was earned long before swords crossed. The early life of Vercingetorix explains why he could unite tribes that had distrusted one another for generations, why he could order destruction and be obeyed, and why he could hold power without a crown in a culture that despised kings. By the time history notices him, the foundation is already complete. The rebellion that follows is not the story of a sudden uprising. It is the culmination of a childhood lived under pressure in a society tearing itself apart while a greater power closed in. Vercingetorix did not rise from nowhere. He rose from memory, loss, and preparation, and by then, Gaul had no other choice. Long before Alexandria arose to dominate Egypt's coastline, Thonis Heraklion stood watch at the mouth of the Nile, controlling the most important gateway into the kingdom. Every ship arriving from the Mediterranean passed its harbors first. This alone made the city indispensable. It was not simply a port, it was Egypt's customs gate, religious threshold, and economic filter rolled into one. The Nile Delta was Egypt's lifeline, and Thonis Heraklion sat precisely where river and sea met. Goods flowed through its docks in constant motion. Grain from the fertile interior, papyrus, linen, gold, and sacred offerings moved outward. Wine, olive oil, metalwork, and foreign luxuries moved in. Officials monitored cargo, collected taxes, and enforced regulations long before merchants could trade deeper inland. The city was built for water. Canals replaced streets, boats replaced carts. Warehouses, temples, and administrative buildings rose along shifting channels that connected the city's many islands. To an arriving sailor, Thonis Heraklion must have felt alive, almost floating, with traffic moving in every direction and ritual activity woven directly into commerce. Power here was not only economic. Thonis Heraklion was also sacred space. Before foreign traders were allowed to conduct business in Egypt, they were required to make offerings to the gods of the city. Temples stood near the docks, ensuring that trade began with ritual submission. This blending of religion and administration reinforced Egypt's worldview. Prosperity flowed from divine favor, not mere profit. The city's population reflected its role as a gateway. Egyptian priests lived alongside Greek merchants. Sailors, translators, tax collectors, and laborers crowded the harbors. Languages overlapped, customs mixed, yet order remained strict. This was not a free port. It was controlled, observed, and regulated at every level. For centuries, Thonis Heraklion thrived because of its position. As long as the Nile fed Egypt and the sea brought trade, the city mattered. It grew wealthy, confident, and deeply embedded in Egypt's infrastructure. No one building temples or warehouses here believed the ground beneath them would ever fail. From the surface, Thonis Heraklion looked eternal, anchored between river and sea, unaware that the very water sustaining it was quietly preparing its disappearance. Thonis Heraklion was not just a city with two names, it was a city that lived in two cultural realities at once. To the Egyptians, it was Thonis, a secret port bound to ritual law, divine authority, and the ancient rhythms of the Nile. To the Greeks, it was Heraklion, a familiar gateway named after Heracles, the hero they believed had once set foot on its shores. Both names were used, often by the same people, depending on who was listening.
This dual identity reflected the city's unique position at the crossroads of civilizations. Greek merchants arriving from the Aegean did not feel entirely foreign here. They recognized the name Heraklion, saw familiar gods equated with their own, and found communities already adapted to cross-cultural exchange. Egyptian priests, meanwhile, maintained strict religious control, ensuring that foreign presence never challenged sacred order. The blending was practical, not sentimental. Egyptians tolerated Greek traders because they brought wealth and goods Egypt desired. Greeks respected Egyptian ritual because access to trade depended on it. Control depended on it. Religion became the common language. Greek gods were identified with Egyptian ones. Heracles was linked to local deities associated with strength and protection. This integration made commerce smoother and conflicts rarer. Documents and inscriptions suggest that Tanis Heraklion functioned as Egypt's official international port long before Alexandria existed. Foreign ships were required to dock here, register their cargo, and pay dues. Only then could they travel onward. This gave the city enormous leverage. It decided who entered Egypt and under what conditions. Daily life reflected this balance. Greek sailors drank in Egyptian taverns. Egyptian officials learned Greek trade terms. Mixed households were not uncommon, yet boundaries remained. Sacred spaces stayed Egyptian. Political authority remained local. Cultural exchange occurred, but always under supervision. The city's two names were not competing identities, they were tools. Each allowed different groups to understand the same place through familiar concepts. Tanis Heraklion succeeded because it could be many things at once without losing control. This flexibility made it prosperous and resilient, but also dependent on stability. The city thrived as long as trade flowed and rituals held meaning. When those conditions changed, its carefully balanced world would have nothing solid to stand on, except water, memory, and a name that would eventually sink with it. Religion was not confined to quiet sanctuaries. It dominated the city's layout, rhythm, and authority. Temples rose directly beside harbors and canals, ensuring sacred presence oversaw every arrival, transaction, and departure. The most important sanctuary was dedicated to Ammon-Gerb, a local form of the powerful god Ammon. This temple was immense, built of stone meant to last forever, anchored by colossal statues and sphinxes that guarded its approaches. To step into the city was to enter divine territory. No ship passed without acknowledging these symbols of authority. Sacred canals connected temples to one another, turning ritual processions into floating ceremonies. Priests moved statues of gods through the waterways on elaborate barges during festivals, reenacting myths and renewing divine favor. These events were public performances of power, reminding inhabitants and foreigners alike who truly ruled the city. Offerings filled temple storehouses. Gold, grain, incense, and imported luxuries flowed into sacred hands. Temples acted as banks, redistributing wealth, funding construction, and supporting priestly hierarchies. Religious authority and economic control were inseparable. The architecture reinforced permanence. Massive stone blocks rested on seemingly solid ground. Columns rose from platforms built to resist flooding. To ancient builders, the city felt secure, protected by gods and engineering alike. Foreigners were required to participate symbolically. Before trading, merchants offered gifts or paid ritual fees. This was not superstition, it was political theology. Egypt's wealth existed because the gods allowed it. Ignoring them invited chaos. Temples also stored records, measured water levels, and regulated calendars. They were administrative centers disguised as sacred spaces. Knowledge flowed through priests as much as power did. Ironically, this emphasis on permanence made the city vulnerable.
Heavy stone structures pressed into unstable sediment, accelerating subsidence. The very monuments meant to anchor Tanis Heraklion helped pull it downward over centuries. Still, during its height, the city's temples stood as proof that divine order and human ambition could coexist. River and sea met beneath sacred watch, and for generations, Tanis Heraklion appeared unmovable. The gods seemed firmly planted, the water seemed obedient. No one suspected that the foundations beneath those towering sanctuaries were slowly dissolving, grain by grain, preparing to erase a sacred city from the surface of the world. Tanis Heraklion did not gain power by accident. Its wealth came from control, not excess. Every ship entering Egypt through the Nile Delta stopped here, generating revenue through taxes, storage fees, ritual offerings, and inspections. The harbor was constantly alive. Merchant vessels from Greece, Phoenicia, Cyprus, and across the Mediterranean anchored beside Egyptian barges loaded with grain and stone. Cranes and laborers worked along docks built of wood and stone. Warehouses rose close to the water for rapid transfer before tides or currents shifted. Trade was tightly regulated. Officials recorded cargo, weighed goods, and enforced restrictions. Certain items could not pass inland without permission. Smuggling was punished severely. Tanis Heraklion was both marketplace and checkpoint, with ritual framing every transaction. Captains made offerings alongside paying taxes, reinforcing Egypt's authority. Annual festivals amplified the city's importance. Sacred processions drew crowds from across the delta. Divine statues were carried on barges through canals, accompanied by music, incense, and chanting. These events blended religion and spectacle, reinforcing loyalty and attracting visitors. Wealth was visible in colossal statues, decorated shrines, and finely carved reliefs. Coins and imported luxuries circulated widely, and even ordinary laborers experienced abundance through festivals and temple distributions. Yet prosperity bred dependence. Tanis Heraklion's identity was almost entirely tied to its role as a gateway. As long as trade flowed, the city thrived. If conditions shifted, relevance would vanish. This vulnerability was invisible at first. For centuries, nothing challenged the city's position. The Nile continued to flow, ships continued to arrive, temples continued to receive offerings. But beneath the surface, pressure built. Sediment shifted, foundations strained. Far to the west, Alexandria had not yet been founded, but the conditions for its rise were already forming. Tanis Heraklion stood at the peak of its influence, wealthy, sacred, and indispensable. It did not realize that its greatest strength, control of trade, would one day be transferred elsewhere, leaving its temples, harbors, and rituals without purpose, standing on ground that could no longer support them. Tanis Heraklion did not gain power by accident. Its wealth came from control, not excess. Every ship entering Egypt through the Nile Delta stopped here, generating revenue through taxes, storage fees, ritual offerings, and inspections. The harbor was constantly alive. Merchant vessels from Greece, Phoenicia, Cyprus, and across the Mediterranean anchored beside Egyptian barges loaded with grain and stone. Cranes and laborers worked along docks built of wood and stone. Warehouses rose close to the water for rapid transfer before tides or currents shifted. Trade was tightly regulated. Officials recorded cargo, weighed goods, and enforced restrictions. Certain items could not pass inland without permission. Smuggling was punished severely. Tanis Heraklion was both marketplace and checkpoint, with ritual framing every transaction. Captains made offerings alongside paying taxes, reinforcing Egypt's authority. Annual festivals amplified the city's importance. Sacred processions drew crowds from across the delta. Divine statues were carried on barges through canals, accompanied by music, incense, and chanting. These events blended religion and spectacle, reinforcing loyalty and attracting visitors. Wealth was visible in colossal statues, decorated shrines, and finely carved reliefs. Coins and imported luxuries circulated widely, and even ordinary laborers experienced abundance through festivals and temple distributions. Yet prosperity bred dependence. Tanis Herakleon's identity was almost entirely tied to its role as a gateway. As long as trade flowed, the cities thrived. If conditions shifted, relevance would vanish. This vulnerability was invisible at first. For centuries, nothing challenged the city's position. The Nile continued to flow, ships continued to arrive, temples continued to receive offerings. But beneath the surface, pressure built. Sediment shifted, foundations strained. Far to the west, Alexandria had not yet been founded, but the conditions for its rise were already forming. Tanis Herakleon stood at the peak of its influence, wealthy, sacred, and indispensable. It did not realize that its greatest strength, control of trade, would one day be transferred elsewhere, leaving its temples, harbors, and rituals without purpose, standing on ground that could no longer support them. Tanis Herakleon did not gain power by accident. Its wealth came from control, not excess. Every ship entering Egypt through the Nile Delta stopped here, generating revenue through taxes, storage fees, ritual offerings, and inspections.
Control depended on it. Religion became the common language. Greek gods were identified with Egyptian ones. Heracles was linked to local deities associated with strength and protection. This integration made commerce smoother and conflicts rarer. Documents and inscriptions suggest that Thonis Herakleon functioned as Egypt's official international port long before Alexandria existed. Foreign ships were required to dock here, register their cargo, and pay dues. Only then could they travel onward. This gave the city enormous leverage. It decided who entered Egypt and under what conditions. Daily life reflected this balance. Greek sailors drank in Egyptian taverns. Egyptian officials learned Greek trade terms. Mixed households were not uncommon, yet boundaries remained. Sacred spaces stayed Egyptian. Political authority remained local. Cultural exchange occurred, but always under supervision. The city's two names were not competing identities, they were tools. Each allowed different groups to understand the same place through familiar concepts. Thonis Herakleon succeeded because it could be many things at once without losing control. This flexibility made it prosperous and resilient, but also dependent on stability. The city thrived as long as trade flowed and rituals held meaning. When those conditions changed, its carefully balanced world would have nothing solid to stand on, except water, memory, and a name that would eventually sink with it. Religion was not confined to quiet sanctuaries. It dominated the city's layout, rhythm, and authority. Temples rose directly beside harbors and canals, ensuring sacred presence oversaw every arrival, transaction, and departure. The most important sanctuary was dedicated to Ammon-Gerb, a local form of the powerful god Ammon. This temple was immense, built of stone meant to last forever, anchored by colossal statues and sphinxes that guarded its approaches. To step into the city was to enter divine territory. No ship passed without acknowledging these symbols of authority. Sacred canals connected temples to one another, turning ritual processions into floating ceremonies. Priests moved statues of gods through the waterways on elaborate barges during festivals, reenacting myths and renewing divine favor. These events were public performances of power, reminding inhabitants and foreigners alike who truly ruled the city. Offerings filled temple storehouses. Gold, grain, incense, and imported luxuries flowed into sacred hands. Temples acted as banks, redistributing wealth, funding construction, and supporting priestly hierarchies. Religious authority and economic control were inseparable. The architecture reinforced permanence. Massive stone blocks rested on seemingly solid ground. Columns rose from platforms built to resist flooding. To ancient builders, the city felt secure, protected by gods and engineering alike. Foreigners were required to participate symbolically. Before trading, merchants offered gifts or paid ritual fees. This was not superstition, it was political theology. Egypt's wealth existed because the gods allowed it. Ignoring them invited chaos. Temples also stored records, measured water levels, and regulated calendars. They were administrative centers disguised as sacred spaces. Knowledge flowed through priests as much as power did. Ironically, this emphasis on permanence made the city vulnerable. Heavy stone structures pressed into unstable sediment, accelerating subsidence. The very monuments meant to anchor Thonis Heraklion helped pull it downward over centuries. Still, during its height, the city's temples stood as proof that divine order and human ambition could coexist. River and sea met beneath sacred watch, and for generations, Thonis Heraklion appeared unmovable. The gods seemed firmly planted. The water seemed obedient. No one suspected that the foundations beneath those towering sanctuaries were slowly dissolving, grain by grain, preparing to erase a sacred city from the surface of the world. Thonis Heraklion did not gain power by accident. Its wealth came from control, not excess. Every ship entering Egypt through the Nile Delta stopped here, generating revenue through taxes, storage fees, ritual offerings, and inspections. The harbor was constantly alive. Merchant vessels from Greece, Phoenicia, Cyprus, and across the Mediterranean anchored beside Egyptian barges loaded with grain and stone. Cranes and laborers worked along docks built of wood and stone. Warehouses rose close to the water for rapid transfer before tides or currents shifted. Trade was tightly regulated. Officials recorded cargo, weighed goods, and enforced restrictions. Certain items could not pass inland without permission. Smuggling was punished severely. Thonis Heraklion was both marketplace and checkpoint, with ritual framing every transaction. Captains made offerings alongside paying taxes, reinforcing Egypt's authority. Annual festivals amplified the city's importance. Sacred processions drew crowds from across the delta. Divine statues were carried on barges through canals, accompanied by music, incense, and chanting. These events blended religion and spectacle, reinforcing loyalty and attracting visitors. Wealth was visible in colossal statues, decorated shrines, and finely carved reliefs. Coins and imported luxuries circulated widely, and even ordinary laborers experienced abundance through festivals and temple distributions. Yet prosperity bred dependence. Thonis Heraklion's identity was almost entirely tied to its role as a gateway. As long as trade flowed, the city thrived. If conditions shifted, relevance would vanish. This vulnerability was invisible at first. For centuries, nothing challenged the city's position. The Nile continued to flow, ships continued to arrive, temples continued to receive offerings. But beneath the surface, pressure built. Sediment shifted, foundations strained. Far to the west, Alexandria had not yet been founded, but the conditions for its rise were already forming. Thonis Heraklion stood at the peak of its influence, wealthy, sacred, and indispensable. It did not realize that its greatest strength, control of trade, would one day be transferred elsewhere, leaving its temples, harbors, and rituals without purpose, standing on ground that could no longer support them. Thonis Heraklion did not gain power by accident. Its wealth came from control, not excess. Every ship entering Egypt through the Nile Delta stopped here, generating revenue through taxes, storage fees, ritual offerings, and inspections. The harbor was constantly alive. Merchant vessels from Greece, Phoenicia, Cyprus, and across the Mediterranean anchored beside Egyptian barges loaded with grain and stone. Cranes and laborers worked along docks built of wood and stone. Warehouses rose close to the water for rapid transfer before tides or currents shifted. Trade was tightly regulated. Officials recorded cargo, weighed goods, and enforced restrictions. Certain items could not pass inland without permission. Smuggling was punished severely. Thonis Heraklion was both marketplace and checkpoint, with ritual framing every transaction. Captains made offerings alongside paying taxes, reinforcing Egypt's authority. Annual festivals amplified the city's importance. Sacred processions drew crowds from across the delta. Divine statues were carried on barges through canals, accompanied by music, incense, and chanting. These events blended religion and spectacle, reinforcing loyalty and attracting visitors. Wealth was visible in colossal statues, decorated shrines, and finely carved reliefs. Coins and imported luxuries circulated widely, and even ordinary laborers experienced abundance through festivals and temple distributions. Yet prosperity bred dependence. Thonis Heraklion's identity was almost entirely tied to its role as a gateway. As long as trade flowed, the city thrived. If conditions shifted, relevance would vanish. This vulnerability was invisible at first. For centuries, nothing challenged the city's position. The Nile continued to flow, ships continued to arrive, temples continued to receive offerings. But beneath the surface, pressure built. Sediment shifted, foundations strained. Far to the west, Alexandria had not yet been founded, but the conditions for its rise were already forming. Thonis Heraklion stood at the peak of its influence, wealthy, sacred, and indispensable. It did not realize that its greatest strength, control of trade, would one day be transferred elsewhere, leaving its temples, harbors, and rituals without purpose, standing on ground that could no longer support them. Thonis Heraklion did not gain power by accident. Its wealth came from control, not excess. Every ship entering Egypt through the Nile Delta stopped here, generating revenue through taxes, storage fees, ritual offerings, and inspections. The harbor was constantly alive. Merchant vessels from Greece, Phoenicia, Cyprus, and across the Mediterranean anchored beside Egyptian barges loaded with grain and stone.
I hope you liked the whole story. Good night.